welcome. I'm Lucy Rigby, Labour's PPC for Northampton North. Thank you very much for joining this panel. We're going to be talking about Labour's vision for a better future of work. Ambition. Ambition is the theme of this conference, and we're going to be talking about ambition for each other in the context of creating a higher wage, high skill, more competitive, more dynamic economy that delivers growth and allows us to deliver on Labour's ambitions for the country, as Keir was setting out this morning. So it's fantastic to be joined by Alison McGovern MP, the Shadow Minister for Employment since 2021. Ali's been the MP for Wirral South since 2010. She's also previously had several other key front bench roles as the Shadow Minister for Culture and Sport, Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury, Shadow Minister for Children and Families and International Development as well. You may have noticed I said shadow a few times there. One of my main jobs as the PPC for Northampton North is to try and remove that shadow bit from Ali's title and get her into government where she belongs. I'm also joined by Graeme Cooke, the Director of Evidence and Policy at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, where Graeme leads teams looking at the nature and causes of poverty and developing policy solutions to alleviate it. So Graeme's previously worked for IPPR for 2 London boroughs and as an expert advisor to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. So we're going to hear from Alison first. I'll bring Graeme in. I may well also abuse my position as the chair to talk a little bit about a Northampton perspective, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions as well. So it's over to you, Ali, to start.
Thanks, Lucy. Can everybody hear me okay? Streaming friends at the back, is it okay if I stand up like this? Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much. I would just like to say really quickly, thanks so much for coming to Progressive Britain Conference. I thought Keir's speech this morning was absolutely outstanding, and I'm so pleased to be here talking about the idea of a progressive, ambitious Labour government. It feels like we've made huge strides, and when we saw those results come rolling in after the local elections, I felt so many emotions, relief that there was finally the possibility of change on the table, but also an anxious feeling that what we want to do now is to keep going and move on. Because now we've opened that door to the possibility of a Labour government, I think it's incumbent on us all to actually get the job done. So what does that mean in the area of work? Because often we're focused in politics on the cost of living crisis, and rightly so, because have you seen food inflation? It's absolutely, literally bananas. I think bananas are about 3 times the price of what they were. So we often focus on prices. Really important, really challenging. But the other side of it is the money in people's pockets. And I don't think that we have talked enough about the jobs that people do and the money in people's pockets. Because in the end, getting people good, sustainable, well-paying jobs is the other way that we tackle the viability of family life at the moment. We make sure that there's enough money in people's pockets. So it's that side of it that I just want to say a few quick words on today. And I think there's 3 levels of government intervention, and 3 ways in which our country needs to change so that people can have more ambition for themselves, we can have more collective ambition for every town and city in our country, and we can change some of the assumptions that exist in the United Kingdom about where people come from and the jobs that they do. And we kind of need to tackle some long-standing low ambitions for people. So I'm going to talk a little bit about job centres and literally the intervention that the government makes in millions of people's lives every week by the employment supports that it offers people. Also this idea of a towns and cities approach and what it looks like for every place to have a plan. And finally, change at the UK level, because the UK government, it's not all about devolution. The UK government has got to be different as well. So Firstly, job centres. Anyone been in a job centre recently? Anyone? I mean, I'm guessing that the people who've just put their hand up have been in a job centre because they work in the policy area. No? Okay, what did you think of the job centre?
A bit humiliating. A bit dehumanising. Very process driven. I think, particularly the people I spoke to who were in the job centre felt like they were treated with a degree of suspicion when going in there.
Humiliating, suspicious. Anyone else got job centre views? Even if you've not been in one, why would you not go to one? David?
It's 10 years old, but that was exactly the experience when I went to one then when I needed to get support. It's dehumanising, no dignity like you talk about.
No dignity, yeah.
I work with Job Centre Plus in my role as lead on economic development on my local authority. And I don't think businesses put all their jobs through the job centre. So therefore it tends to be the lower end jobs that get advertised for the job centre.
Yeah.
I'm convinced of that.
That's right, Terry.
I went in the crash in 2009, and it's only a place to claim benefits.
Yeah.
It's a gateway to claim benefits. It's not a place to get jobs. I'm not actually told that. It's not a place for you. You've got literally qualifications.
Yeah, you'll be fine, out the door, as quickly as you can, yeah? You're not for us, yeah. So, this is so frustrating to me because job centres exist for a reason. They exist for a really good economic policy reason, and they have done since Beveridge and Eleanor Rathbone and a whole host of other economists who understood the workplaces of the 19th century and the 20th century so well. They created the labour exchange for a really good reason, which is that if you are a person on low pay, you face a huge amount of barriers to moving on and moving up at work. And one of those big barriers is a market failure of information. That because you're working so hard, you don't necessarily know what jobs are available and the way in which that could pay you more and could help you get a good, sustainable career. So they created the labour exchange so that people who were doing poor quality, casualised work could move into better paid work and have a more sustainable life for their families. The labour exchange existed for that social and economic purpose. And we have moved from that to job centres whose purpose has become social security monitoring, basically. It's a kind of way of making the social security system work, which is really about compliance. And obviously we want conditionality in social security. We want there to be rules so that people can trust the system. But we've lost that sense of the labour exchange purpose that was supposed to provide people with help and information so that they didn't just have access to the jobs that they knew existed, but they would have access to the kind of jobs that would really help them move on in life. And the first change that I think we need to make is to return job centres to their true purpose and figure out what the jobs are of the future that are coming and give people that pathway into them. And I could blather on for hours about work coaching and how we shift from a conversation that we have with people that's fundamentally negative, that at best says to people, we can't really help you here, and says to every single person who walks through the door of a job centre, we absolutely can help you. And whether your barriers to a better job are poor mental health, or whether it is feeling a bit lost in a world of work that's changing, we can really help you here. So for me, that's the first big change that we need to make. As I said, I can bore for England about this, but the Tories have actually purposefully made job centres about getting people any job. It's become just a culture of get people out of the door, get people off my list, not about the best job possible. And I think that's the first thing that we need to change. Second point, and I promise I won't consult the audience about everything, because we really will be here for hours. But second point, towns and cities. Now, we're here in London today, and I think it would shock many people to know that even in London, where the streets are paved with gold, some of our, they're really not, are they? I mean, I've been actually quite shocked about the level of empty shops that we seem to have in the centre of London now. So it's clear that, we still have a lot more to do. And some of our London boroughs have unemployment rates that are significantly above average. And there are some towns and cities in Britain who have unemployment rates twice the national average. Now, if you listen to Rishi Sunak, he can't even get his numbers right in the House of Commons based on what the actual numbers are. But if you listen to the Tories, they will tell you that unemployment is fixed, that we don't have a problem with unemployment in this country anymore. And that is just not true for loads of our towns and cities. Then add to that the problem that we definitely do have, which is inactivity and people who have kind of felt like they don't really have a good choice in work because they've got a disability and there isn't a job that works for them, or because in too many of our towns, we really have too few job options. We have a lot of low-paid jobs in some places. Nearly a quarter of jobs are actually at the minimum wage. And that is not a good enough set of options for people. So I think we need to put towns and cities in the lead, because having grown up in Merseyside in the 1980s and 90s, during which time the population of my city halved, I can tell you what it feels like to grow up in a place where you feel there is nothing down for you here. It is not a good place for any young person to exist, where you feel like your place, where your family and your friends are, and where people love you, there aren't real prospects. We shouldn't let any place go through that. So everywhere needs to have a plan. What does that mean? It means towns and city leaders having the access to best possible information about the economic prospects for their place. And it means in those places that are able to, real power to set direction. Now, Peter Kyle and I work very closely together, and he was telling me about the job centre in Portslade in his constituency. And it turns out the streets aren't all paved with gold in Brighton either, especially not after the Greens have been in charge. And in the poorest part of his constituency, the job centre was closed high-handedly from London. But I asked myself, why can't we let people in Brighton take those decisions? They know much better how to run the job centres. And definitely in Greater Manchester, where our Metro Mayor, Andy Burnham, has got an economic plan, why can't he take decisions about employment support and what programmes we should have to help people get the jobs of the future in Greater Manchester, where he knows in Media City or in the other growing areas of that economy where those jobs are and how to design job centres and employment support programmes much better than we ever will from Whitehall. I'll give you another reason. One of the big areas that we've got problems with employment is rural areas like Cornwall. Very different economies from the place I grew up with in the Wirral in Merseyside. Yet today, if I became the employment minister tomorrow, I would be making decisions about the location and support services and job centres in places like Cornwall, a county I've been to twice in my life. That makes no sense, so we've got to change it. And this fits in with Keir's plan for, as he said earlier, taking back control, and not devolution for the sake of it, but devolution with a real economic purpose so that every place has an economic plan. Final point of change, and then I really will shut up, Lucy, I promise. The UK. So I don't think it should be as controversial as it has sometimes felt to talk about class discrimination in the United Kingdom. I think we don't always talk about socio-economic or class discrimination as much as we talk about other forms of discrimination, but I think that we should. Because I think, whilst it's perhaps harder to define, I think we all know it when we see it. I think everybody knows what it looks like and feels like when somebody looks down their nose at you. And whether because of your accent, or because of the school that you went to, or because of the clothes that you wear, I think we all know that not everybody in our country has a fair crack of the whip. And I think we also know statistically that certain professions and certain jobs are dominated by people who come from higher socioeconomic groups who come from certain schools. Now, luckily for us, the last Labour government left a legacy on this front, and it is Clause 1 of the Equality Act, which would give a public duty to the British government and all public bodies to counteract socioeconomic discrimination. Why would we do this? Well, let's come back to the job centres I began with. Because I think part of the way in which job centres have had this culture of telling people to get any job, of providing a poor quality of service, is because of who that public service is assumed it's for. And I think if we ask the government to reform itself and to really take on the idea that certain jobs are for certain kinds of people in this country, I think we could really make a difference. So we change job centres, we change the support that's available for people so that they can get the best job possible. We have a towns and cities approach, meaning every place needs to have a plan. And we bring into force Clause 1 of the Equality Act. We take on socioeconomic discrimination. We say there is no limit to the ambition that we have for every person in this country. That's how I think a Labour government can make a difference.
Thank you very much indeed, Ali. I'm going to hand over now to Graeme.
Thanks very much. Well, that was brilliant. That was brilliant to hear and hard to follow.
No, but you have to disagree with me, Graeme, otherwise it will be boring.
I think what I'll say will echo some of the points Alison made, but also develop them in different areas. I mean, I want to start just by reflecting a bit on the kind of likely challenges that an incoming Labour government would face in 2024, and in some sense how they would contrast with that which faced the incoming Labour government a generation ago. Because if we think back to the late 1990s, the overwhelming focus was on high unemployment, particularly based on the kind of memories of the 80s and 90s recessions. And so the focus then was very much on, youth unemployment through the New Deal, setting up the job centres, which happened in the late 1990s. But I think if we look ahead to the inheritance of the next Labour government, it's going to look quite different. And I want to pull out two sort of major challenges that I think speak really directly to this question: can we provide hope and ambition for people across the country? So the first one is about the quality of work, just as much as the quantity. And there's a big debate in the conference today about how we generate more good jobs, which is really, really important too. But there's a question about the quality of work for people who have it now. And that's partly about this question of in-work poverty, which has grown massively since the late 1990s. In the late 90s, about a third of working age households who were in poverty had a working adult in it, and that is now 2/3, a massive, massive change. That's partly about low pay, but actually low pay is one of our success stories, actually building on the legacy of the national minimum wage. Low rates of hourly low pay have fallen. So this question of in-work poverty is as much about questions of insecurity, I think, and Labour is talking about taking back control at the level of our kind of towns and cities, as Alison said. But I think there's also a question about control for individuals too, and the lack of control that many people have in the modern workplace. Significant minorities facing unstable hours and pay, many people lacking kind of autonomy, control and voice in the workplace, and not enjoying the basic kind of flexibilities and protections that many of us take for granted, whether that's about sick pay or maternity and paternity provision, protection from unfair dismissal, the ability to negotiate the hours that work for family life, and of course a big enforcement challenge. Even the rules that we have in the labour market are often not properly enforced, and this is bad for individuals, but it's also bad for our economy, for productivity and for growth in general. So a big priority for the next Labour government's got to be confronting this kind of labour market insecurity, giving back people control in the workplace, extending the experience of good work to more people, as Alison said. But there's a second challenge, which Alison also mentioned, which is about these entrenched patterns of labour market exclusion. This word inactivity is often used, but I prefer we talk about exclusion. There are people systematically excluded from the labour market, but people with long-term health conditions and disabilities, lone parents, people from certain ethnic minority backgrounds, and that is a major, we've got a high employment rate in this country, but significant challenges of certain groups systematically excluded from the world of work. So only around half of disabled people are in work, compared to over 80% of people without a disability. And so certainly while cyclical unemployment stays relatively low, this has to be one of the labour market challenges. And I think there's a risk sometimes that kind of the poor quality of some work and the insecurity of parts of our labour market can take the edge off that challenge. But I want to sort of say that it'd be a huge mistake to sort of trade these challenges off against one another, especially from a social justice perspective. So in-work poverty is much too high, but it's also true that your risk of being poor is far higher if you're not in work than if you are. So only about 10% of people in work are in poverty, compared to nearly half of people who are outside of the labour market. There's evidence that good work is good for your mental health, for social connections, for identity and purpose. But more important than any of that, it's what people want. We have 2.2 million sick and disabled people of working age not participating in the labour market who say they want to work now in the future. That is an absolutely fundamental group, I think, for a future Labour government to focus on in this area, who want to work, who are not looking for work now, who are excluded from it. And our task is not to let some of our anger about the mismanagement of the welfare system in the last 10 years take away from the urgent social justice priority for that group, and to give them hope and ambition of a better future, both financially but also socially and emotionally as well. So the challenge for Labour, I think, is to advance both these areas together and see how they're complementary, improve the quality of work, security and control in the workplace as part of a broader economic strategy, as well as tackle sort of systematic exclusion from the world of work that many people feel. So let me just say something about the kind of priorities if we take those two things seriously and see them as the major inheritance challenges for an incoming Labour government. So on employment insecurity and job quality, I think there's actually a fairly clear agenda, much of which the Labour Party has already been talking about. So a real case for a stronger minimum floor in our labour market, rights to minimum hour contracts, proper notice of shift patterns, compensation if those shift patterns are changed, further increases in the minimum wage, and a case for expanding the role of the Low Pay Commission to do exactly what it's done on low pay, which is to push up employment standards as far as we can without them significantly damaging employment. There's then a need for kind of stronger social partnership, particularly in sectors which we know are characterised by low pay and poor quality work, care, hospitality and retail, building on this challenge that employers have around recruitment to try and drive up employment quality. Things like flexible work as a default, better childcare, better good quality part-time work, and then reversing this something that isn't talked about enough, this huge decline in workplace training for people in low-paid work, massive problem. And if we want people to be able to progress in the labour market, improve their standards of living, their careers, that is going to have to be addressed too. Then on employment support and labour market participation, I think the way ahead is less straightforward, because we're more reaching into the dark and trying to reimagine the way in which we've thought about some of these services and support, as Alison said. Now, this, to use a slightly jargony term, work first is sometimes what this gets called. And there is definitely a risk that system, which is about trying to get people into a job as quickly as you can, has tilted too far to the point of leading to poor job matching, people not necessarily getting a job that works for them and that's going to stick. And that, as Alison said, breeds this kind of culture of compliance over engagement. And so people kind of, I spent some time as a volunteer on an employment program once, and it completely soul destroying. People, literally just kind of ticking the box of, making sure they'd applied for enough jobs to kind of satisfy the conditions of their benefit. So that model, that workforce model, is definitely ineffective for the group who are excluded from the labour market because of structural disadvantages. But when we think about that question, we often debate a lot about kind of the benefit system, the conditionality rules, this question of like what should be done nationally and locally. But I think one of the key things for us to remember is like, what is the actual support that is likely to help those groups, kind of irrespective of whether it's the state or another provider, whether it's done nationally, whether it's done locally. And in some sense, I think we haven't debated that enough, and what we need for different sorts of groups. And like the benefit system obsessed with categorising people, assessing them, putting them into different boxes. But actually there's sort of two broad groups we might want to help. One is people who are basically looking for work. They want a job, they're looking for a job. And rather than put them through a regime of conditionality and compliance and monitoring, what we need there, as Alison said, is a kind of job centre which is there to provide them with information and advice, access to training, to provide a much better recruitment service for employers. These are people who are wanting a job, they're trying to get a job. We need to try and help them get a job that really fits their motivations. And there's another group who are not currently looking for work, but who might want a job, who might not want to write themselves, might want to think that their time working is finished, where we're going to need a different model to try and encourage them to see work as possible and desirable and something that is going to be good for them, rather than thinking we're going to sort of mandate them or force them into that kind of system. And I think that does mean a different system from the sort of traditional Job Centre Plus model. It's sometimes called supported employment. I think that's the sort of model we need to think about. It's sometimes called place, train and maintain. So it's still a work-focused system. It's still about helping people to get a job, but it's fundamentally driven by their own desires and motivations, the importance of a relationship between them and a coach who's supporting them, and much more active brokerage with employers to make work possible, to turn that kind of motivation into action. There's loads of potential options. I think this is where we're going to need a sort of culture and a period of experimentation and learning, access to work, work trials, job redesign, work experience, job guarantee schemes, apprenticeships, help to start a business, a whole range of things which we very rarely talk about because we always obsess about the benefit system and the conditionality rules and never nearly enough about the actual types of support that might help people to realise their ambitions. And to imagine we might start from a system that, rather than when you turn up you are assessed and put into a category and made to wait until you get this, that and the other, one that starts with conversations about, do you want to work, what kind of work do you want to do, what would help, and so all these questions of assessments and conditionality move much more into the background rather than the foreground. And they're probably confronting the fact that we're going to need to invest more in this area if we're going to enable more people to access the benefits of being in the workplace and have a stronger social security safety net underneath. So I think that for me is this kind of question of hope and ambition, which is how do we offer hope and ambitions for the person who is in work but doesn't feel they're in control, doesn't feel like they can progress, and how do we provide hope and ambition for those people who are outside the world but who don't think it's for them, but who also don't want to be written off and don't want to think that their opportunities for employment and its benefits are over.
Thanks very much, Graeme. I'm not sure, Ali, if there's enough disagreement there.
It's not nearly enough.
Not nearly enough.
Come on, this is no fun.
Let me, we'll open up for questions in a second. I just want to respond very quickly to what Ali said and what Graeme said, specifically from a Northampton perspective. It's fantastic, obviously, Ali to hear us talking about harnessing ambition. And Graeme, what you were saying about the quality of work and infrastructure. One thing that is increasingly common when we're out knocking doors in Northampton, we see is that people are working multiple jobs, sort of 4 jobs often between a couple, in a family. So dad will work during the day, often a couple of jobs starting very early, then going on to another one, while mum is looking after the kids, and then mum will work all night. And then she'll look after the kids again the next day. So we're seeing more and more of that as these cost of living pressures are increasing, as childcare is also becoming more and more expensive. And I think what comes alongside that really strong work ethic is this sense of ambition and people really wanting to get on. That is really, really palpable in Northampton. People, they're desperate for their kids to get on, and you've got families literally working around the clock, as I said, to allow their kids the opportunities that they want them to have. What's also true, I think, alongside that, is that people feel held back. They're doing all that in spite of the government, and these barriers that are being put up. Those barriers, I think, as I said, childcare costs, really, really poor public transport, so, harder to get to work, complete lack of an industrial strategy, and bringing sort of higher wage, high skilled jobs to Northampton, lack of investment in skills and in schools. I could go on and on, but I think what's really important is that we've got to reward hard work with decent pay, and people are desperate for a government that's on their side and helps harness all this aspiration, Ali, which is exactly where we are. So that's my specific Northampton input. open up for questions now. I'd be very grateful if you could say your name and where you're from. Yes, we'll take this man here.
So, my name is Harry Parsons from Hackney South.
Oh, wait a sec, Harry, wait a sec for the mic.
Harry Parsons from Hackney South. I think a lot of people would say that the job centre brand is quite toxic. Nationally, I think it has a reputation it has certain stigmas attached to it. I'd also say that job centres broadly look very unwelcoming. The urban design and architecture is not something that particularly encourages people to visit them. Ali, would you consider looking at rebranding and redesigning these institutions in order to make them more attractive and more user-friendly?
Do you want to take a view?
Yeah. There were a couple at the back. Okay, we'll take this chap here and then Ryan. We'll take three. Sorry, this chap here in the check shirt.
Hi, Tim. I'm originally from Warrington and I live in Didcot. And I just want to ask about casualisation, really. I work in the university sector, which you'd think with 3 degrees you'd have a bit of job security. But I don't know what my job is past July. And that's the picture for a lot of people we've got 1 year job here, 18-month job here. You're stuck in rent, which are going up. Yeah. I'm stuck on trains, which means I lose my money and my will to live. Yeah. I can't put down. I've got the money, but I can't buy a house. And it's very specific to the university sector, which is crumbling and needs massive help. Our university should be the rival of the world, but our staff are being undervalued and being thrown to the wolves. But it's in other sectors too. So yeah, good pay, but what can Labour do? What is Labour going to do about getting rid of casualisation so that people feel secure in their jobs, so they're not worrying that, well, what is it now, May, 3 months' time, I'm going to have to apply for another job again, I might have to move again, and that's not conducive to a productive workforce within my household or within the country as a whole.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tim. And then it was Ryan in the grey jumper.
Thank you so much. It's Ryan Wayne from the Tony Blair Institute. Thank you so much for a great conversation. I've got a policy question and a controversial question. So let me go with the policy question first. From my own experience, my dad worked in Fort and Haywood, my mum worked in the Gyro Bank, which seemed to employ everyone in Liverpool. But I left Liverpool to go to London, studied here, didn't have a network at all, but by chance and with a lot of luck on my side, managed to build one. I found myself having a really enjoyable career in the private sector and also working for Tony now. But I love your ambition around social economic background and class, but it seems to me the biggest barrier is network. And so in the private sector, people who knew the CEO, or even if didn't know them, but their parents would have done a job like that in the past, just had a natural advantage. And I wonder, is there an opportunity or a role that the job centre, the career service, or some sort of national scheme can play in just trying to balance up networks? Or can we be ambitious and get rid of nepotism entirely? And I say that now knowing a lot of nepo babies. The thing is, they're all lovely people, so we don't want to necessarily throw them under the bus, but there does need to be some change there. My controversial question is a political one, and it's around identity politics, which I think has really gripped the left, and often for good reason. There are many underrepresented characteristics, people who deserve to be positively discriminated, actually, and given a step up in order to balance representation. But class isn't necessarily one of those things that you can see. Sometimes it's something you can hear through a regional accent, but not always. And so how do you make sure that organisations who I think have been pretty successful actually in rectifying some of the representative issues when it comes to characteristics that you can see are able to actively and positively ensure that people from socio-economic backgrounds are given opportunities?
Thanks very much, Ryan. Ali, shall I come to you first?
Yeah, can everyone still hear me if I sit down? Yeah, okay, great. All of these things are connected, in that I really think that part of the toxicity on job centres is because of who they're seen to be for. And because we, quite rightly for many years, have tried to target resources in a way that doesn't generate, as the old economists would say, dead weight loss. We sort of say to people who we think will be all right at getting a job themselves, like, you're fine, you know, we don't need to offer you that much support. And I think that has generated this mistake, because I think we've forgotten the original purpose of the labour exchange, as I was saying. And I think if we sort of rethought about job centres as a more universal employment support service that would deal with the toxicity and also help with some of these inadequacies that mean that we basically get kind of socio-economic discrimination in the way that we offer people support at work. So I've got a completely open mind, actually, about what this looks like in the future, and I would like to hear from I want to hear from some of our town and city leaders about how they see it going. I don't want to walk into this policy area thinking that all of the answers must be had in Westminster and Whitehall. So I'm open-minded about whether it's a rebrand, or whether actually an employment service of the future might actually be based out of FE colleges, for example, which looked... Yeah, or libraries, exactly, and that's a great idea. Maybe it's a thing that exists in libraries. Anyway, which connects to your point, Tim, about casualisation, which is that if we understood the labour market properly, we'd be able to focus on areas where we do have hyper-casualisation and where that is an inhibitor to our productivity. If DWP wasn't trying to micromanage the interactions of every member of its staff, which it currently does, up to and including, you know, telling people for how many minutes they may speak to somebody on universal credit, then I think it could focus on proper academic evidence and analysis of the labour market, so that we could say, okay, our mission is highest employment in the G7. We need to do that sustainably. So what are the barriers? What's the geographic contours of our labour market? And what are the structural contours? And where does that casualisation exist? And how can we negotiate our way out of it? Which is what I would do. Make sure that DWP was actually an economic ministry and a proper labour department, not just a kind of social security processing centre, if that makes sense. Which finally brings me on to Ryan's point about networks. Well, I would like there to be a network that you know, young people or people of any age could join, that would give them access to people who had all kinds of life experience, who could help support them make progress and help them achieve their ambitions. I would like there to be that network, and I think it's called the Labour Party. And I'm being a bit facetious, but actually not. I think that's what the Labour Party is for. I think that's what it was designed for, to make sure that working class people and people of all backgrounds can have their hands on the levers of power in this country. So I won't detain everybody on my ideas of, you know, reforming the Labour Party so that it does that well. But I think you make a really good point about Nepo babies, right? Which is like, it's kind of funny, this conversation, in a way, right? You know, the kind of privileged children of actors going, no, I am a nice person, honestly, yeah. But actually, you don't blame individual people for structural inequality. You find structural answers to structural inequality. So what that means is us making sure that, yes, of course, people have got good schools to go to everywhere in the country, but also that in workplaces that we find those responses so that we address true talent, not just the kind of who knows who network. And actually, I've been really inspired by some businesses that have, you know, ditched CV writing as a recruitment tool, that have found that I spoke to one business where they got people to make a video of themselves. Well, like, young people from working class backgrounds are actually really good at social media. And that's a way of finding talent that doesn't rely on who you know or what school you went to. So I think that there's lots of ways, and I think government could be inspired by the best of the private sector here. But most of all, you know, we have this big institutional tool, which is our political party. And if we can't mobilise that in support of the ambitions of working class people, then what are we even in it for?
Thank you very much, Ali.
Rant over.
Graeme, do you want to come in on some of that?
Yeah, sure. Okay, partly in the interests of disagreement, I'll say some nice things about Job Centre Plus in this crowd. So actually, seriously, two things I think I would want to say, not that's different to the other points that have been made, but just to not forget. So one is, Job Centre Plus is also full of people. So we talk a lot about the institution, but a lot of government employees work in job centres, and certainly from my time in local government, working with people who work in job centres, there is a lot of actually frustration with the system from people who work in job centres, actually a lot of people who try to innovate and do things differently but are frustrated by the way the system works. So I would just caution us to remember to distinguish between job centres as an institution and sort of hard-working public servants who work in job centres who need to be sort of part of the solution. And I think I'm probably crying out for a sort of different kind of policy regime. And then the second is that there are, we mustn't lose, this isn't only a Job Centre Plus point, but we mustn't lose sight of the fact that our regime, put it that way, has kept unemployment low for a long time in spite of big economic upheavals and recessions. And that is a good thing. And that the fact that short-term unemployment still has not returned in the way that it did in the 80s and 90s is not something to be complacent about. Now, that's not to take away, I talked in what I said about the importance of focusing on quality of work as well as the quantity of it, of thinking about labour market exclusion. And it's not, and I wouldn't at all say that the reason those things have happened is purely or even largely because of Job Centre Plus. But that is really, really important because, recessions that lead to high unemployment are really, really bad news for individuals and society as a whole. And so we must hold on to that. The other thing I did want to say, though, to slightly counterpoint, is this point about networks, I think, is really, really important. Like, our system is around individualized relationships between one person looking for a job and one person in an employment support service of any kind trying to help them. And I think that massively underplays the role of networks in helping people kind of address any barriers to work, as well as helping them access jobs. Most people get jobs because someone tells them about a job and they know someone, and the power of networks in this world is massively underplayed, I think, and the rules of the system make it much harder. And then the third is this point about location. This is another local government point, really, which is spent a lot of time when I worked in local government trying to get the job centre people out of the job centre and into the places that people actually go. And so I do definitely think whatever you do about the kind of brand and the institution, the question of where you go to get help to find a job, and whether that's provided by the council or the job centre or another provider, we could be much, much more creative about how we do that.
Thanks, Graeme. I think we will take another 3 as long as people are relatively quick. I think we've probably got time for. Okay, we'll have this chap at the front if someone can get you a mic.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's a couple of quick points and questions. Firstly, I was very struck by the comment you made, Alison, about rural affairs. I'm a former director of public affairs at Country Land and Business Association. It's a big failure of Labour Party over decades about the mistreatment and the lack of policy for rural issues. I wonder if you had any other comments to make other than just Cornwall's got a low unemployment rate. Also, on networks, I've recently been volunteering for the Citizens Advice Bureau and also a debt advice agency, Crosslight, in Hammersmith in West London. There is a huge amount that we can do with stakeholders. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about where you think employment support might benefit from stakeholder engagement. Again, one of my former roles was head of policy influence and stakeholder engagement for an arm's length body from the Home Office, Security Industry Authority. It's got a lot that it has done in training and employment support for people looking for work.
Okay, thank you very much. Joanna at the back, and then there's a lady behind her as well.
Hi, my name's Joanna Baxter. I'm chair of the NEC. In my other life, I'm head of local government for Unison, Scotland. And one thing that strikes me in terms of the world of work is this issue about flexibility and digitisation. How do we ensure that the benefits associated with greater digitisation actually benefit workers throughout the income scale rather than just those middle and higher income brackets? And I say that as because I see members coming to me on a daily basis, social care workers that we could not do without, for whom digitisation means monitoring where they are, when, how many minutes they spend with a service user. But for the managers who manage them, that digitisation flexibility means working from home or working remotely and being able to switch off at certain times. So it seems that digitisation means increased employee monitoring for those on lower income brackets, but greater flexibility for those on higher income brackets.
Great question. Thanks, Joanna.
Thank you. My name is Valerie and I'm from Islington North, CLP, but in my own capacity speaking. Great panel, by the way, and all the stuff you've mentioned. I want to be very specific and talk about the 8.2% of Black and African and Caribbean diasporans within the UK that are unemployed, and talking about race audits. I know it can be controversial, but many people within that particular demographic are either disabled or working mums like myself, or they might have issues in terms of like their religion. So some employees are not always as accommodating. And I think what we've seen during COVID is, you know, work being online or working from home remotely, etc. And then also with giving people more time if they have special educational needs to be able to access work in a different capacity. So I hope that makes sense. Thanks.
It does make sense. Thanks, Valerie. Okay, I'm conscious of we're going to need to hard stop at 3, so this might need to be relatively brief on both of your parts. Ali, do you want to?
Thank you. All really good questions. And really quickly on I think we definitely need more of a rural policy than just things are not great in Cornwall. But actually it comes back to the point that I would make about DWP at the UK level, that at the moment, because it does a lot of micromanaging, it doesn't do a lot of analysis. So, or at least the analysis that it doesn't publish, and therefore we just don't have good policy making in general. And I think about challenges like the Chancellor just allocated a whole ton of money, rightly, in my opinion, for better childcare. But if you're in a rural place, actually your access to childcare is significantly constrained for geographical reasons that we have just paid insufficient time getting to understand. And so I think that there's a way of trying to change things at the UK level that means that local leaders have much better evidence and analysis, and particularly for those rural areas, understanding their health challenges or their education challenges. I think getting that interconnection between national and local government could be much better, and I think that's part of the way that mission-led government can help, because then you have to look right across all different aspects of government and say, how does that interconnect with the different places in our country, and whether or not they're able to meet that challenge. So it's a combination of the local and the national working better together. On the issue of race, this is very important, and I think we need to look at the Equality Act, as I was mentioning before, and think about how those points of interconnection and intersectionality function. We know that when it comes to employment, this is one of the most important areas where people might face different forms of disadvantage and discrimination, and we need to understand how that works. Then make sure that we've got really good quality employment support services that are tailored. And again, it comes back to that UK-wide mission, but delivered in a way that is going to help lift people up, whatever their barriers and their challenges. And I think we can do that, particularly, in London, for example, groups of local authorities around areas have developed really good employment support services that are targeted at that. I used to be a Southwark councillor. I'm a proud northerner, but I really got to learn a lot about the different parts of London and how different forms of discrimination interact to hold people back. When I was a councillor in Camberwell, and I've seen it done better by London boroughs, and so we want to work with those people. And Joanna, you describe this problem really well, I think, about the inequality that technology can sometimes reinforce. I think you might agree with me when I might say that trade unions have an important role to play here. And it sounds facetious, but actually what unions can do brilliantly is organise agreements prior to technological change, so that the proceeds of growth that come from technological change are shared more equally. And we decide in advance how companies can handle technological change. So that I think of those people in a care home, for example, they can either be monitored or they can gain the autonomy that comes from technological analysis of people's medical needs, of the medicines regime or other things, which can free up care staff to do a much more rewarding job. So I think unions have got to be a part of it, as well as all of the rights that we want to see through the New Deal for workers. Was that quick enough?
That was very quick indeed, and conveniently as well, Graeme said that he doesn't necessarily need to come in on those points, which means that we are dead on 3 o'clock. Woo! So well done, everyone.